The Talksport Fan Network.
The ultimate on-demand destination for the UK's best fan-led football podcasts.
Want authentic supporter insight on all things Bournemouth? Follow Up the Cherries in all departments on the Talksport Fan Network.
Club-dedicated content created by the fans, for the fans.
Search Talksport Fan Network.
Hello Cherries fans and welcome to Up the Cherries in all departments. Today I'm joined by a former AFC Bournemouth player from the late 60s and 70s, and we dive into his whole career from his time at Charlton, Gillingham and also at Torquay, and also his career after football and what he thinks of the club today. So today I'm joined by David Stocks. Hello, David, and welcome to Up the Cherries in all departments. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. And how are you?
Very good, thank you. And looking very much forward to learning more about yourself.
If I can remember that far
back. If we can start with sort of at the beginning. Born in Dulwich in South London, is that right? In 1943?
Actually, Dulwich. The W is not pronounced.
Dulwich. Okay. Excellent. Yeah, learn something new every day. What was it like for a young child like yourself growing up in London as the war came to an end?
I think the impressions, the first thing I remember really is bomb sites everywhere. I mean, London was battered, as we well know, during the Second World War. And some of the sites actually had unexploded bombs on, which was, looking back, is a little bit scary to say the least. In fact, my mates and I found one bomb that was unexploded, and we reported it to the authorities, and we appeared in the local paper saying that we were sort of heroes finding this unexploded bomb. So sounds a bit scary to say the least, but at that time, sort of part of life, really.
Yeah, they're great. It's it's amazing and great to learn about, obviously, experiences from around that time. But obviously in your book, which I've got a copy of here, fantastic book, thoroughly enjoyed reading it. You mentioned that you watched London teams like Fulham, Chelsea, Arsenal when you were younger. What superstar players of that time did you get the privilege to watch?
So Arsenal, Chelsea, Fulham. There's two or three players probably that stand out. One is fairly obvious, Johnny Haynes, which was just an incredible player. But in terms of the positions I played in, which was mainly defensive, George Cohen, right back, Jim Langley, who was my particular favourite, the left back, who had quite an attacking instinct. And I suppose in a way, looking back, I would say I almost sort of put my game together on the basis of watching Jim Langley.
Excellent. During the 1950s and 60s, football and your other passion, cricket, is unrecognisable to how these sports are today. Can you share with us how did a young man who nearly represented England at schoolboy level in cricket came to play for the London Schoolboys?
Yeah, there was back at that time, there was no structure as there is today. And I was sort of spotted, I suppose, playing for my school, which got me into the London schoolboy team. But for some strange reason, it got me into the Surrey schoolboys team, because West Norwood, where I went to school, was not really in Surrey. So how that came about, I'm not quite sure, but it was great. Yeah, I was a left arm, quickish sort of bowler that batted, so I was slightly different from most. So yeah, it worked very well.
Excellent. A little bit on the football side. While you were developing as a player, you played up front before being placed at left back. Did you have a talent in front of goal, or was your stronger position always defensive?
My talent in front of goal, as Ted McDougall would say, was, I won't do the accent and I'll miss out some of the language, very ordinary. So the sort of centre forward thing was not my scene at all, in fact. And Ted, when I finally got to play with Ted McDougall, he firmly put me in my place.
So it was always inevitable to become a defender in the game. I
think so. I had defensive sort of instincts, and I was left-footed, and my right foot was really for standing on. So left back sort of suited it. And I quite enjoyed, back then there was a sort of a fashion of fullbacks doing a bit of attacking rather than just staying back and hanging around. So that really shaped my game, I think.
Excellent. Charlton, how did the opportunity arise to sign for Charlton?
It was a strange one, really. Although they were a London club and I was a London lad, they actually spotted me playing for South London Schoolboys, which was quite a strong team. And I also played for London Schoolboys and Surrey Schoolboys. So Charlton's scouting system sort of found me, as it were. And a chap called Peter Croker, who was the brother of Ted Croker, who might be a better known name, spotted me, and the rest is history.
So once you were at Charlton, you made your debut for the first team at one of the world's most famous football grounds, Anfield, against Liverpool. What can you remember from making your debut there, and which famous stars did you face that day?
I can remember the nervousness.
Yeah, I can imagine, yeah.
When we went out on the pitch before the game, this is back in the time, so the warm-ups and such like didn't sort of happen in those days. But we walked out on the pitch to have a look and see what it was like. And the lights were off, and there was just a few lights on, and the crowd started whistling. And I have to say, to this day, I can still remember the nervousness creeping into my body at the time. So it was tough.
Was there any? Because I'm not too familiar with the Liverpool side of the day, but was there any star players that you played against on the day?
Yeah, the two, or say 2 or 3 main players would have been the 2 wingers who I'd be interested in, Peter Thompson and Ian Callaghan.
Ah, yes,
and of course, sort of midfield defensive was Emlyn Hughes. So nothing to be frightened of there. A couple of wings coming at you.
Yeah, a couple of those names I am actually familiar with now that you've mentioned them. Yeah, so it's what a wonderful debut that must have been to play at Anfield and make your debut there. As part of, I think, the second chapter in your book, you speak about Millwall and playing them in the Kent Challenge Cup. What
Yes.
was the rivalry like between Charlton, West Ham, and Millwall during your era at the Valley?
Well, they were called friendlies, but believe me, that was not the case. Certainly, Millwall. I mean, anybody who went to Millwall in those days, and especially Charlton, who were sort of neighbours, it was not a pleasant experience. Just leave it at that. I'll leave it to your imagination. Playing at the Den.
Yeah. I can. Oh well, I've been to the a Den a few times over the years watching Bournemouth, and I can I can definitely imagine that one, what that must have been like. During your time at Charlton, you came up against some legendary players like Bobby Moore, Jeff Hurst, Jack Charlton, Billy Bremner, Johnny Giles. Some of them who were under the leadership of Don Revie at Leeds. What was it like to grace the same pitch as these legendary players, and who was the toughest player that you had to play against during your career?
Well, these were all international, and it was being on the pitch with them. The first thing I had to do was almost allow myself to be on the same level as them, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. You know, I couldn't go onto the pitch and think, well, I'm a 19-year-old lad and these are stars, because you can't mentally allow yourself to do that. So I had to kind of force my psyche up to be on the same level as them, and quite mentally, I wouldn't say mentally exhausting, but mentally difficult to cope with, apart from the physical side of things. So it was fabulous, and probably once the match was over, you could reminisce, but out on the pitch, very clearly these guys were better than most of us.
Yes, it must have been an honour to play on the same pitch as some of those names. In terms of maybe your toughest opponent, is there anyone that stands out during your career who you would say was probably one of the toughest players you played against at all? Or
first one that comes into mind is a nasty little bit of work, but a lovely guy off the pitch, a chap called Alan Ball.
Ah, right, okay.
Yes, who was a midfield dynamo, for want of a better expression, but pretty awful to play against. But off the pitch, charming guy. So Alan Ball, although he was a midfield player, I didn't come into contact with him too much. But when you did, you really had to take care of yourself. So he was one, and a couple of Liverpool wingers, Callaghan and Thompson. Crumbs, you don't get much better than them two, do you?
No. It sounds like a real handful to deal with. If we just carry on with Charlton for the moment, one of your best mates at Charlton was Keith Peacock.
Yep.
He's also best man at your wedding, and a Charlton legend. He's still involved at the club now, I believe. How did you rate him as a player, and what was his secret to such a long career at Charlton?
Keith was a very intelligent guy. I mean, he had a grammar school education, which suggests that he was a bright lad. But he was also very laid back, and he quickly realised, I think, that he was very good at scoring goals, as opposed to maybe getting involved in the general play. Obviously, he did get involved in the general play, but put him in front of goal, and he used to say that everything calmed down, and he just simply put the ball in the back of the net. very simple but very effective.
Yes, he is still there. Is he still involved at the club now, Keith?
I think he is. Yeah, we used to call him Snatcher because
Snatcher?
he was one of these Snatcher. Because he was one of these guys that, you know, you're playing a game, you're battling, and suddenly the ball would go to him and he'd pop it in the back of the net, you know, and you'd come off winning 1-0 and think, how on earth did we get away with that? And that's why we called him Snatcher. And
Snatcher.
Snatcher came about at Charlton. The training facilities were nothing like what they are nowadays. And we used to run round the pitch. I mean, internationals, Marvin Hinton, you know, Mike Bailey, all these guys, England, Scottish internationals, John Huey, running around the pitch. And then once we'd run around the pitch about a dozen times, we then used to adjourn to out on the car park at the back of the stand, and we'd have England with Mike Bailey, Marvin Hinton. You know, I wouldn't put myself in their category by any means, against the rest of the world, and the rest of the world would be John Huey and some of the other internationals. And that was quite interesting, to say the least. And the prize for winning, I mean, it wouldn't happen nowadays, would be a bottle of Coca-Cola from the net. So there would be fights and there would be all sorts going on to get this bottle of Coca-Cola. Incredibly different to nowadays.
Yeah, massively. Because the training day to day at Charlton back then, did you train every day, or was it? Because obviously we know how the players train these days, that they're training all the time. Was it the same for you guys back then?
We trained most days, but just during the morning. So from 10 till 12. So training, say at Charlton, would be run around the pitch on the track, and the trainer would say sort of things like, okay, we start off with a couple of laps to warm up. We'll do half a lap, we'll do 6 of them, and we'll do, 4 or 5 sides. And then we'd adjourn to out the back on the car park and play a little 6, 7, 8 aside. And that used to get a bit feisty, believe me. And the likes of Marvin Hinton, Mike Bailey, people who played for England, John Huey played for Scotland, and these guys, you know, just playing like they were playing for their country. But it would be London versus the rest of the world. I mean, unheard of nowadays, but it's the way it was.
Yeah, it's amazing same as when I was reading your book. It's amazing to learn about the older days and how different football is now to then. It's so different. But after you made 31 first team appearances for Charlton, your time at Valley Parade came to an end, and you moved on to Gillingham Football Club, which was managed by Freddie Cox at the time, I believe.
Yes.
What attracted you to Gillingham at the time?
Well, basically, Charlton gave me a free transfer at the end of the season. And they told, to be fair, they had quite a lot of fullbacks at the club, so I think I was surplus to requirements. So to be fair to the manager at the time, he allowed me to play a couple of games in the sort of first team, and I played in a so-called charity match against Millwall, which was never a charity match in those days. And Freddie Cox was at the game, saw me play, and said, I like what you've got. Can you come and join us? And probably within a couple of months, I changed from playing with international players and getting the ball down and passing it to someone who then decided that any opposition, the first thing you did was give them a little reminder that you're around, and became quite a physical player. So quite a difference in style, to say the least. But very effective.
Yeah, Yeah, no, definitely. With Freddie Cox, he would also manage you at Bournemouth. How did he differ to previous managers at Charlton, for example? And how did he? What did he do for your game on a personal level?
I think the first thing he did was provide confidence in your ability. And at clubs like Charlton, with internationals playing, you did feel a bit out of it in a way. But from going from somebody who was just part of the squad into somebody who, for a time, was captain and was told that I was a good player, was quite a difference. So Freddie Cox, in his own way, was quite motivational and very knowledgeable of the game. And also, I think he had a newsagent's business in Bournemouth. So he was very much a Bournemouth type person.
Ah, right. I never knew that. That's you learn something new every day. What are your first games at Gillingham, if I'm correct? Was a friendly against Charlton. What was it like to play against your former teammates so soon after leaving?
Well, firstly, there was not friendlies between Charlton and Gillingham. There was history, I believe. But to play against my old mates I found it quite difficult to really commit myself to the game. You know, these are fellas I'd grown up with pretty much and learnt an awful lot from. So it wasn't easy, let's just put it that way. But playing against my mates, you know, the likes of Len Glover, Keith Peacock, those sort of people, good mates of mine, really good mates, grew up with them. So it was difficult, but enjoyable.
Yeah, excellent. It was only a short spell for you in Kent, I believe. But you had some memorable games there. Could you talk us through some of them?
Yeah, I mean, Gillingham was a sort of club that nobody liked visiting, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
They certainly were a very physical side, and I was very quickly told that it would be part of my game. So I had to fit in with the way they played. It wasn't a matter of, obviously, of them adjusting to my way. You know, I'd come from Charlton playing with internationals, so that was a very different way of playing, because people, with the greatest respect, at Charlton, the players were international, some of them. So they were excellent players and would not stand any messing around, if you know what I mean. There was one or two physical guys in there, but in the main, they passed the ball around. Gillingham, it probably went the other way around. Nobody enjoyed coming to Gillingham to play. It was not a place that you wanted to go to play. And that was the message that the management sort of conveyed to us as players. And, you know, after a month or two, you quickly bought into that.
Yeah.
Quite frightening back then. But I guess nowadays that wouldn't be the case. But back then, I think referees were a little more lenient, let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think it's still a tricky place to go, Priestfield. Not been there for a fair few years, obviously with Bournemouth being further up the league. But I do remember it being a tricky venue to go and play there and pick up points. But just touching on Bournemouth there, Bournemouth and Boscombe Athletic Football Club would be your next club. But the move at the time you weren't keen on, I believe.
Yeah, I was a bit surprised that I'd been given transfer type thing. You know, I Bournemouth to me was South Coast. In fact, what I did when I was first told about it, I actually went to get a map and look to see where it actually was. So it's not really what I wanted at that time with the family and children and stuff like that. But it was first team football. So that was part of the deal. And so I drove down and I thought, this is actually quite a nice place. Why not?
Yeah.
So, and I think, to be honest, a lot of, dare I say it, but a lot of players that have come to Bournemouth say the same thing, you know. And if you've come from, I don't know, somewhere up north-ish, Midlands, and come down to Bournemouth, it is a bit different, isn't it?
Yes, massively. And the town's obviously changed a lot now, but I would imagine back then it was a beautiful place to come, especially if you lived up north, like you say. Freddie Cox again was at Bournemouth, I believe. He showed you around the club. He painted a picture of the club. What was your first impressions of the club itself?
Mainly, my thoughts were positive. And with the town being a seaside resort, it was a bit different to living in and around London. The club and players were very welcoming. It was quite laid back, and I soon made, you know, great friends. And the supporters around the ground were really backing you. And once I think you showed a bit of commitment and perhaps made a few tackles and headers and stuff like that, they warmed to you fairly quickly. They didn't suffer fools gladly, believe me, but once you put a bit of effort in and commitment, they were with you.
Yeah, smashing. Yeah, in your book, you talk us through like a diary of a footballer, and it details your training, days off, and how managers would differently conduct a Friday before match day. In terms of present day, do you think present day footballers have it easier training wise than you did back in the day?
I'm not sure really. I think the training that we did, to a certain extent, individuals did not necessarily what they wanted back then. They did things that were right for them. And I think the players, they probably had a bit more respect from management and trainers. And especially, say, people like me who'd been to one or two clubs. So I think that in today's world is probably not the same. But nowadays, with all the technology and fitness regimes and goodness knows what, it's difficult, I think, nowadays to hide, if that's the right word. You know, back in the day, if we'd been out on a tour with the lads to celebrate a birthday or something the night before, we probably wouldn't be at our peak, let's put it that way. But come Saturday, we were there. Believe me, we were there.
If I could take you back to the 1969-70 season, which ended with the club unfortunately relegated to the old Division 4, new manager
Yes.
come in the shape of John Bond, and Bond went on to make you captain. How did it feel that a new manager just joined the club and approached you to become captain?
I think, call me old-fashioned, but I considered it an honour to be made captain of the club, especially by a new manager. As an ex-Charlton player, I was very familiar with the West Ham way of playing, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, we're not that far apart, and there was one or two players who went from one club to another. John Bond, in my opinion, was an excellent coach. West Ham bred, and I liked the way West Ham played, etc. well schooled in the West Ham way. The club I admired, you know, and West Ham, I wouldn't say were neighbours, but they were fairly close. His weakness, in my opinion, was his difficulty in handling the players.
Okay.
Especially those that had been at the club for some time. And once he had moved a lot of the players he wanted from West Ham, I think he felt more comfortable that he could control the team.
Okay.
Quite a few come in from West Ham, which was fine. You know, that's football, isn't it?
Yeah.
So a bit tricky. I'm being reasonably diplomatic here, but it could have been and was a little bit of a difficult time, but you just adjust to what the situation is.
Yeah. I've got a great quote from a Cherries legend. Stocksy was a great pro. I liked what he brought to the club. Now that was a quote by Cherries' all-time record goal scorer Ted McDougall. For someone who never saw Ted play, obviously I being too young, how good was he, and what was he like to play alongside?
Ted was a phenomenon. I mean, when he first came to the club, some of the senior players thought, who on earth is this? We couldn't understand a word he said because he was seriously Scottish, and he was great. I mean, great sense of humour, very quiet, sort of looked you up and down, and then he made his decision on what sort of person you were. But he was phenomenal. I mean, he was totally focused on scoring goals, and that was it. There was no other part to his game, really. I mean, most of the setting up play, he had this mate of his, Phil Boyer.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Who was from York with him, who was a fantastic player and deserves all the credit in the world, for Ted's success. And once you got sort of Tony Scott from West Ham on the wing, crossing balls, and Ted loved crosses coming into the box because, as those who've seen him play, you know, that was his dinner, really. I mean, he was just incredible. So, but he was a talking guy. He'd be one of these guys you're playing up north at some club, battling away, trying to stay in the game and maybe get a draw out of something. And then with 5-10 minutes to go, suddenly Ted would create a bit of space and score a goal, completely against run of play. Where'd that come from? So he was that sort of a guy. And as long as he was in the team, you were probably going to score a goal. At least one.
Yeah, I mean, my dad can remember watching Ted and yourself and many others, and he's always said that he's never seen a goal scorer like it, even today in comparison to today's players. But another few notable names that you played alongside, obviously you've mentioned Phil Boyer already, Fred Davis, John Benson, Terry Gulliver, John Sainty. How did you rate these players, and how important were they to Bournemouth's promotion?
I think what you've just said there, when you mention those players and the fact you can remember them, is quite interesting, because that was a team that didn't like to lose and were very, very keen to win. Now that may sound very basic. In actual fact, it's quite important, because if you've got guys out on the pitch who really do want to win the game and not lose, you're halfway there. You know, and it may sound strange to perhaps people who've not played football professionally. You know, people would say, well, once you go on the pitch, you obviously want to win. Well, you obviously want to win, but you're prepared to put your body on the line, as they say. And I think that team around that time, with Ted McDougall up front, and of course it's not Phil Boyer, who was his mate. And we probably tried to get the ball out to Tony Scott on the wing, who was the best crosser of the ball I've ever played with. Ted then just used to finish the job off. And as he would say, simple. You get it in the box, I'll get it in the back of the net. It is as simple as that. And the sooner you get it in, the better. And there are certain words that Scottish players tend to use that I'm not going to say on this, but then Ted would simplify it right down to that sort of level. And, if you can score 30, 40 goals a season, you've got to listen to him, haven't you?
Yeah, massive.
Ted, what do you want? That was a question that I asked him. What do you want? And in his own Scottish lovely way, it was very simple. Just get the balls out wide, get them in the box, and I'll score. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nice football. Also, during your time at the club, you played with a future manager of Bournemouth in Mel Machin. What was he like as a player, and did you ever see him as a possible future manager?
That's a very good question. First of all, Mel, I thought was a very, very good player. He was a right back, and at the time I was a left back. Strange as it may seem, I actually learned quite a lot from Mel playing at left back. He was very quiet, a classy, I would say, meticulous type of player who had a good turn of speed. He had a nice bit of pace. In today's world, I think he'd without doubt be a Premiership player. So I was a little surprised when he went into management because he was fairly quiet, but quite a deep thinker. Very interesting to talk to when you got him to talk. And as a captain of the team at the time, I tried really hard to encourage him to say what he thought, because quite often he'd just walk away shaking his head. and I think he's obviously not happy about something, new signing, all that stuff. Perhaps I ought to go and have a word. And he was lovely, nice guy, very quiet, very meticulous. And he went into management, which didn't surprise me to a certain extent, but at the same time, it did surprise me. He wasn't a loud, outrageous sort of individual. He was kept his thoughts very in. He didn't sort of let too much come out. But great player, very good player. In today's world, he would be definitely a Premiership player.
That's really interesting to learn. Because I have read stuff about Mel as a player and how he was a cultured player and examples like that. So to hear it from someone who's actually played with Mel is fascinating.
And there was times when the manager would say things like, "What to me as a left back then, Mel being the right back, Stocko or Stocksy as they used to call me, why don't you do what Mel does?" And I had to just shake my head and say, "It's impossible. I can't do that." And I had my own strengths, but Mel was just absolute class. Great player.
Yeah, nice. And also he was successful as a manager at Bournemouth as well to a certain degree by taking us to the Auto Green Shield final and obviously stabilising the club on the pitch while he was at Bournemouth. But back to your promotion season, Bond, he guided the club straight back to the old Division 3 in his first season. How did that season on a whole go for you personally?
the actual footballing side, I thought was great. And the coaching that I had from the management team was very, very helpful. It kind of made me think a little bit more about my game and how I played and so on. The negative, I think, was that management team, John Bond, were coming from a first division side, West Ham, and almost expected the players at Bournemouth to be like the players they'd played with at West Ham. And of course, that's not the case. It's not quite like that. So I think the adjustment of the players at the time, those who stayed and those who John Bond kept there, it was a bit difficult, but the guys that came in were mainly from West Ham and that sort of clubs. So they were good for us existing players, let's put it that way. And I wouldn't say we looked up to them by any means. They were on the same level, but we all learned that those that were there and had been there learned a lot from the management and the players that come in. And I emphasised the players that came in.
Oh, excellent. After a match with Chester, I believe, Bond decided to drop you. He moved Tony Powell to left back and Keith Miller became captain, according to AFC Bournemouth's former club secretary and historian Niall Vatcher's book, Goal Along with the Cherries. John had discussed his reasons with you, but to you, this was new news. Apparently, it's not kind of what happened in theory. What's your recollection of this?
The recollection is very clear. The first time I knew about it, before matches at the weekend, the team sheet, I don't know what they do nowadays, but the team sheet, in other words, those that were playing, was put up on the players' notice board after training on a Friday morning, ready for the Saturday match, which all seemed a bit bizarre in my mind because, you know, you've been training all week and surely you train with a view to playing whoever you're playing. But it wasn't like that. It was sort of set training. Then Friday morning, the trainer would come with the sheet of paper with the team, pin it on the board, and that's who's playing tomorrow. You know, no subs back then and all that sort of thing. So the first time I knew about it was when my name wasn't on the sheet on the wall, which I found a bit strange. So it was a bit difficult. So I went to see him because the guys were all sort of saying, "What's going on?" type stuff. So I went down the corridors, knocked on the door. I was calm, collected. I wasn't, I was annoyed, but I wasn't sort of bored, as it were. And I went to see him and he just said, "I'm not playing you tomorrow and you aren't captain anymore." So this is on a Friday morning. No discussion. As I said before, we didn't always see eye to eye. And that was probably a bit of an understatement. So it was a difficult relationship, if that's the right word, with all the ex-West Ham players coming into the club, which was great. But I think John Bond, was a great coach, fantastic coach, very schooled in the West Ham way. But in terms of handling players, I think he probably was not quite so good at.
Okay. But his assistant, if we can just touch on him for a second, his assistant, Ken Brown, you describe him in the book as a good cop to Bond's bad cop.
Yes.
How do you rate Ken's contribution to Bond's success at Bournemouth?
Massive, because John Bond was the manager, and as you say, Ken Brown was crucial to the club. He certainly got on well with the players, and if the players wanted guidance or support, the players would go to him rather than Bond, which is a bit strange. But Ken Brown was a really nice, loyal, good guy. And it was very much a case of, bad cop, good cop type thing. And looking back on it, okay, maybe it worked. As we all know, within football teams, there's lots of different personalities and lots of different nationalities. Players from the north are quite often very different to players from the south. And then you've got the Scots and the Irish, and nowadays you've obviously got the foreign players coming in. So the management of players nowadays and back then, with the influx of new players, quite difficult to piece it all together. But from a footballing perspective, John Bond's coaching and such like was fantastic. I learned more from John Bond probably in 3 or 4 months than I did in 3 or 4 years from other managers. Nice. So great, but not on the relationship side, let's put it that way.
While at Bournemouth, and this is something that you would never see today's players have to do, but you had to get a summer job with building merchants Kennedy's in Holden Road.
Yes.
What was it like being a pro and then experiencing an everyday job?
I think it was easier for me because before I signed professional at Charlton, I had a proper job anyway. If that's the right expression. And I trained as a draftsman, designing buildings and so on. Because my mother, bless her, said, if you're going to play football, we'll let you, and this is my mother, we'll let you play football for a living as long as you finish your education. And the guy called Peter Croker, who was at Charlton, was brother of Ted Croker, chairman and all that stuff. He was an ex-player at Charlton. He got me a job at a local company, and I spent 3 years training to be a draftsman, designing, would you believe, buildings and foundations for machines. And I spent 3 years doing that, actually making the drawings for foundations and stuff. So I always had if you like, a second string to my bow, if that's the right expression. And it worked quite well. So I wasn't completely 100% involved in football. And the deal was that if I worked for this local company that Peter Croker put me in touch with, I had to play cricket for them at the weekend. So, and I was, to be fair, I was an ex-England cricket, not player, but trialist, and played for Dorset and Hampshire, all that stuff. So the bottom line, I was probably, to be fair, I was probably almost a better cricketer than footballer. And some might not agree. So the whole thing back then, I think the whole thing at that time was just so different to now that, saying things like that, people quite often will look back at you and shake their head and say, no, that didn't happen. But it did. That's the way it was. Very, very different to now.
Yeah, totally different. Yeah, I don't think the players these days don't quite understand that, they possibly would have had to got summer jobs if they were playing in the 60s and the 70s. And yeah, they don't know how good they've got it these days, do they?
Well,
But
Kennedy, I would spend my day with a mate of mine. I got him a job, a guy called Terry Gulliver, who was a player at Bournemouth.
Mhm.
And I got him a job at Kennedy's. I mean, I got the job at Kennedy's as long as I played cricket for them. That was the deal. And after a month or so, Terry Gulliver approached me and said, could you get me a job there for the rest of the summer? And I said, I don't know, I'll ask. So I asked, and the first question back to me when I said, I got this guy, Terry Gulliver, plays for Bournemouth, can we give him a job for the last month or two of the summer? And the first thing the manager said, who would be nameless, said, does he play cricket? And I said, I don't know. He said, well, if he plays cricket, he did play a bit of, I mean, just incredibly different.
Yeah, totally different to today's game. On returning to the third division with the Cherries, things started well results wise, but I believe you suffered a nasty injury, torn ligaments in the knee. In those days, how did players recover from serious injuries like this?
Well, look, a certain amount of it is treatment you did to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I took quite an interest in physiotherapy on that side of things. For example, if someone, say, had a strained knee or ankle or something, the physiotherapist would say, well, we'll put some heat on it. I mean, if you've just done something like that, the last thing you do is put a bit of heat on it. You put some ice on it. So I got quite interested in that side of the game, as it were. So it was almost self-treatment, let's put it that way. I mean, you probably had to attend the ground for treatment. And I think in the book, the trainer, Arthur Cunliffe, who was a lovely guy, did most of the treatment, but he was the trainer. Knew very little about injuries and such like. But it's like I said in the book, when I had some surgery on my hand of late, the surgeon asked me if I remember breaking my hand in the past. And I said, I had no memory of a break, but I do recall injuring my hand in a match. It was strapped up and I was told to get back out on the pitch. You play with your feet, not your hands. It wasn't further investigated, so I'm guessing it was a break after all. I mean, that's probably an extreme example, but that's the way it was.
The 1971-72 season saw you at a bit of a crossroads with a move to a new club on the horizon. I believe Brighton, QPR, Portsmouth and Brentford were all said to be interested in gaining your services. But there was an interesting conversation between you and John Bond where Bond was telling you that he was selling you to Torquay. How did this conversation and transfer come about?
Very suddenly. I'm trying very hard not to be too hard on John Bond. John Bond, for some people, was a great manager. He was certainly a very, very good coach, and I learned a lot from him as a player. Certainly as a fullback, him being a fullback, I learned a lot from him. But in terms of relationships with the players, I think he found it diplomatically quite difficult. and certainly for players that had been at the club prior to him coming. And he very quickly got rid of a number of players from the past and brought new players in, mainly from West Ham. So it came to sort of push and shove, and at the end, Bond said to me that I don't want you at the club anymore. And I was quite surprised. Season before, Player of the Year, played all the games, captain, all that stuff. And I'm selling you to Torquay. No, you're not. I don't want to go to Torquay. Why would I want to go to Torquay? Because I don't want you anymore. And then I realised, of course, he had played for Torquay, so he had a relationship down there. I mean, as it turned out, it worked out okay, but a very difficult individual to deal with as a player. Fantastic coach, fantastic knowledge, not particularly good at people handling, let's put it that way.
Yeah, man management.
Yep.
Your deal with Torquay is a deal that you definitely wouldn't see a footballer have now. Could you explain your contract terms with Torquay?
Yeah, I thought Torquay was a lovely place, and it is. It is. But I was quite settled in Bournemouth, and I had at that time a young family, and I didn't want the upheaval of moving to Torquay. So initially they agreed that I could stay living in Bournemouth, continue training with Bournemouth, which is weird, although it was with the reserves and youth team, which the guys in the reserves and the youth team thought was hilarious. But Bournemouth and Torquay were in the same division, so I couldn't train with the first team. And after I trained with them, I used to travel down to home matches, the Saturday home matches on the Friday, after I'd finished my coaching job at a local private school, Castle Court.
Mm-hmm.
The club down there had a players' house that I was able to stay in overnight. There's a number of players. I mean, if you think about it geographically, where do Torquay get players from? You know, other than maybe Exeter or Plymouth, possibly Bournemouth. The rest, it's up north, it's Midlands, so it's not near anywhere. So they had a players' house where players on loan and players they signed lived. I mean, just so different to nowadays.
Yeah, definitely. But the commuting to Torquay for home and away games, did you find that eventually start to take a toll on you? How did you find that every week?
Yeah, the commute for home and away matches was tricky, to say the least. I mean, Torquay's sort of down south west, as it were, and even from Bournemouth, it's 100 miles or so. So home and away matches, it took its toll physically, really, and also mentally, I think. And eventually, I agreed to move down. I mean, the away matches was probably the most difficult, really, because I used to actually meet the team coach at various service stations, and the club and I eventually agreed that I needed to move down to Torquay. Away matches were a bit different. It meant me meeting the team coach at various service stations on the sort of M5 and such like, leaving my car there, which was, probably not a good idea, but it's the way it was.
Yeah.
And meeting the team coach, getting on the coach, and then after the match up north, Midlands, wherever, they would drop me off at the service station, and I just hoped my car was still there, jump in my car and then drive back to Bournemouth. Not probably ideal, to say the least.
Yeah.
Certainly not in today's world, but
yeah.
Unfortunately, my car was always there, so I was able to get home.
You were appointed as captain at Torquay. What qualities did you think you had that managers always seem to want to make you their captain?
That's quite a difficult question to answer, because it's probably, well, it's obviously my opinion.
Yeah.
So I can't really reply to the question in the words of the manager, because I guess managers will have their own ideas. But I think because in my early days of football, I did other types of work, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And the fact that I experienced normal jobs, if that's the right expression again, I appreciated the life of being a footballer. And I think that was quite a positive for me. It sort of spilled over into my football. And where perhaps players didn't really appreciate what their lifestyle and what they had, I think that sometimes made them a bit awkward and a bit selfish. Whereas I looked at football with open arms, because I'd actually got up at 6 o'clock in the morning and caught a train across London to work. So I'd experienced all of that, and then the rush hour coming back. So my working day was a sort of almost 7, 8 o'clock in the morning to 7, 8 o'clock at night. So to experience the life of a footballer, professional footballer, full time, was like being on holiday. And I used to say that to the guys, I said, it's just so different. You don't really realise, which I think probably made me my attitude towards professional football better, because I appreciated the situation. It's not something I'd had all my life, so I was used to working hard, and I was taking exams, and I used to go to college 1 day a week. They gave me off work, and I used to go three nights a week to college, to get qualifications, and the other 2 nights during the week I used to train. I mean, what? I was never at home. So I'm not saying I was a hero by any means, but I'd experienced all of that. So the life of being a professional footballer is an absolute doddle compared to what I went through. So I appreciated it, and I think that helped my play, if that makes sense. I appreciated everything that was going on, and with the added, if you like, adulation of the crowd and other players and newspaper stuff, and all that side of things, I appreciated all of that. I respected it. So I think in a way, well, not in a way, but I was, let's just say, probably quite different to a lot, if not most, other footballers, because I'd had a proper job, which you would understand. So, having attained my coaching badge, and the fact that I had other firms of work and not just football, which most players tend not to have, I felt the broader knowledge. I could look at the whole picture and not just the football. Also, every time I went on the pitch, I gave the best I had. So I suppose I was a good leader for the team and tried to be a good example to the players, especially the younger ones.
Okay.
Bit long-winded, but
no, it's a really good. really good insight into the leadership side and obviously your experiences and how you brought it all into the game. While at Torquay, obviously you returned to Dean Court. I believe there was a League Cup match as well that you returned to Dean Court for, and played against Bournemouth. What was it like to return to the club where you spent quite a large part of your career?
Well, I'd actually stayed in touch with quite a few of the players, one way or another. And, the words I've written down here in front of me probably sums it up. It says, coming back for a match, however, was not going to be easy, because it's probably a bit dramatic to say I had a strong relationship for Bournemouth, but Bournemouth had helped me an enormous amount to grow up and not just be a talented teenage, early 20s individual, and dare I say, possibly a bit selfish and a bit self-centered. The fact I'd worked a proper job, sort of 9 to 5 and stuff like that, traveling, I'd seen the real world, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So I think that side of it was strong. But having lived and trained in Bournemouth, I was training with the youth team, but I did see and stayed in touch with some of the players. But coming back was not easy. No, difficult.
And you faced a former teammate in Keith Miller.
Yes.
Was he a challenge to play against?
Yeah, he was. He was a challenge. Yes, I think I had a strange relationship with him because he was basically brought to the club to replace me, which was probably not a good starting point. But I got on well with him, and I liked his approach. He was obviously a very good player, ex-West Ham, all that stuff. So, yeah, Keith Miller and a lot of the guys there, they were such good guys, and we battled together. And you go to some of these Midland Northern teams, come away with a 1-0 win with, cuts in your legs and head and battled and Ted has suddenly scored us a 78th minute goal or something, and we're hanging on for dear life, knowing we got a 6-7 hour journey back on the coast, So that was part of the motivation. We got a 6-7 hour journey going back. We don't want to go back with the defeat, do we, lads? That was the kind of approach. It's a bit like being in, dare I say, it was a bit like being in the trenches in the war. You've got a battle. You go north, and nothing's easy up there, apart from the weather being a bit different. They're quite keen on winning matches as well.
Yeah, so you made the decision at the age of 33, I believe, if I remember rightly, to hang up your boots. What goes through the mind of a footballer when having to make major career decisions like this?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I think for me it was slightly easier because I'd had a proper job before football, so I knew basically what I was going back to. I think some of the guys now who've gone through the system with the clubs, it's a whole different world, isn't it, to playing football for a living. And I think to a certain extent you're quite naive in thinking you will play forever, but that's obviously not the case. But I go back to my parents, and my mum had been so strong in her determination that I had a sensible approach to my career in football and making sure I had a good education to fall back on. Whether I'd be like that nowadays with the money involved, probably not. But back then, I was probably earning more money out of football than in it. So it was a very different story. So difficult. But when I had the second broken leg, I realised it was time, I think, to get a proper job and go back to a normal sort of life, as opposed. And I don't care what any footballers say nowadays. It's not a normal life. It's, day after day, you're told how good you are and wonderful and all the rest of it. And that's not necessarily good for your personality.
Yeah, I can see your point of view there. Definitely. You were granted a testimonial by Torquay to play against a combined team of Exeter and Plymouth players. What was the testimonial experience like?
Well, firstly, I think I was very thankful to Torquay, and I told them that, and they were a great club, and the chairman there said, "Well, we feel the same about you, Dave. You've given your all." And I was very involved in the organisation of the testimonial and contacting sort of various players to see if they would play in the game. So I was involved in the setting up of the thing. And I was I wouldn't say amazed, but I was surprised how keen the players were. And not just the players at Torquay. The players at Exeter, Plymouth, those sort of clubs, Bournemouth, were keen to do it, and that was quite nice. And one or two of them sort of said, "Well, you were a good professional, Stocksy," as they called me in those days. And I look at those times and think, yeah, I tried, and I tried every time I went onto the pitch. And I think there's some players that can't say that. I think most players can say it, but there are some, and we probably know who they are, that don't necessarily like playing away at Workington on a Saturday afternoon, which is totally understandable. But I think having had experience of proper work, I very much appreciated the life of a footballer. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we've discussed briefly about real jobs, if that's the right term to call it. But what was the transition like going from a pro footballer to kind of the Monday to Friday 9 to 5 work environment?
Yeah. People have asked me that question before, and I think I found it easier because I had a real 9 to 5 job, and all the travelling and all the qualifications and work that goes with that, and it was that the job was at a reasonably high level, designing buildings and foundations, and if I didn't design the thing in the right way, you don't really want a building collapsing on you, so I had quite a responsible job, and that involved a lot of extra work in terms of college and stuff. So the transition back to a real job for me was, I wouldn't say it was easy, but it was easier. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. And the sporting connections and friends I'd made either in the professional game, the amateur game, like cricket, was a great help in providing options for me. And I'd always had a good work ethic. Mm-hmm. So it didn't scare me, and I was keen to move on to the next chapter.
Yeah, okay. But obviously with moving on to, I keep saying a proper job, a real job, but you carried on playing local football. You played on Saturdays, Sundays, Wednesday afternoons. How many local teams did you play for? And at what age did you eventually stop playing completely?
Well, firstly, I carried on playing football, to keep myself fit. And one or two friends of mine, sort of in the medical profession, were saying that if your body has spent all these years working hard and running around and all that sort of stuff, if you suddenly stop, you're probably going to give yourself a few problems. So try to keep going in some way. And that was the reason for that. And looking back on it, playing pretty much 3 games a week, which was quite a task, really. So Saturday, Sundays and Wednesday afternoons. But they were all local leagues. And we'd play against teams like the Marines and hotels and such like. It got difficult at times because sometimes one or two of the younger players sort of thought, oh, this guy used to be an ex-professional. I think I'll sort him out a little bit.
Yeah.
And that was not pleasant, but I handled it because I had lots of verbal exchanges in my professional career. And I just used to sort of say to them, look, Sonny, don't do that again, because if you do, I'm going to have to do something to you, and it's not going to be very pleasant. And one of their teammates would come up and say, yes, he will, so behave. So it was a strange sort of way of going about it, but I sort of established with myself that I didn't really want to turn around and perhaps be violent back at them. There was no need. And most of the time, we just got back to playing the game. The odd occasion, somebody wanted to do something, but I would say I was probably more than capable of looking after myself. That's probably the polite way of putting it.
So as a financial advisor, which I believe you went on to become, were you more successful and better as a financial advisor than you were a footballer, or?
Some would say yes, and some would say no. To be honest, I would put it on a level par, because I think a lot of work and a lot of life is about attitude.
Yeah.
And playing sport, my attitude was always to win, but at the same time, I wanted to enjoy it, and I wanted people I played against to enjoy it, if that makes sense. And it was quite nice sometimes playing locally football. Some players would come up to me after the game and say things like, Dave, it was great to play against you. Really enjoyed it. And things like that I felt quite good about. And I think work-wise, I didn't continually talk about the past and what I did and all of that. I just got on with the job I was doing. So I think I managed to find mentally a way of doing what I felt was the right thing to do.
Okay. I mean, this has been excellent to sit down with you and go through these questions and learn more about you. And like I say, your book, which I've read, is a fantastic book, and I would recommend that to any football fan, not just Bournemouth fans or Charlton Torquay fans. I'd recommend it to any football fan because it's a great insight into a career during those decades. And finally, I just need to ask you, what do you think of AFC Bournemouth's success that they've had in the recent years? And what would David Stocks at his peak be worth in the transfer market today?
Well, I'll answer the last question first. I would say about 10 million. No. I think it's a difficult question to answer because for me, playing football for a living, which I eventually did, it wasn't my whole life. It was a piece of it, if that makes sense. And I was quite clinical about becoming a professional footballer, but also I was very clinical in retiring from being a professional footballer.
Yeah.
So I fortunately, moving into the world of finance work-wise, suggested perhaps that I did have a fairly structured brain and perhaps a financial type of brain. So I broke it down into things like that, in that sort of a way. I was very structured in my thoughts and what I wanted and what I wanted to do. Football is difficult because there's a lot of things that can happen that you can't control. Injury, transfers, winning, losing, etc., managers changing. Moving into the real world of work, financial work, is very much more black and white. You know, you can do this, you can do that. You can't do this, you can't do that. So it was a different world, but I think the competitive piece comes in to play quite a bit. So that side of it, I think, I probably would have a slightly different approach maybe in today's world with the money side of things.
Yeah.
Because the rewards nowadays are massive, aren't they?
Yeah.
Back then, I mean, comes when I started, the maximum wage was £20 a week.
It's amazing.
All right, £20 a week is not £20 a week nowadays.
No.
But you know, the Johnny Hayneses and the stars, £20 a week. That was it. That's the most you could earn. I mean, I don't know what it would be worth in today's money, but it still wouldn't be a huge amount.
No.
So I think it's obviously the game has moved on. Financial side has moved on massively. So it's quite difficult to compare, but you can, I can just do my best to compare it for you.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's the success that AFC Bournemouth's got now. I mean, what do you think of the success Bournemouth's had over the last decade?
Well, I use the word unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean it.
Yeah.
I mean, how? Why? How did it, what came, what's happened? I mean, come on, this was a third division South, toyed with the fourth division of the Football League, and it's now a Premiership side with millions of pounds taking the place of perhaps hundreds of pounds. And for the town itself comes, anybody coming down to Bournemouth in the winter, which people do. They come to Bournemouth in the winter months because its climate is reasonable. To be able to go and watch, if they can get a ticket, able to go and watch Bournemouth play in the Premier League, I mean, that's just incredible. So I think AFC Bournemouth and the people behind the scenes, management, directors, etc., I think they deserve great words, because they've moved to a level that some years ago, let's be honest, none of us could foresee, could we?
Yeah.
Totally. Okay, money helps, we understand that, but you still got to get the results and you still got to do the job. I think to cap it all off would be a new ground.
Yeah.
But I think they're being quite sensible about that, and not wishing to spend millions and millions of pounds. So I think just an incredible story. And someday, one day, somebody will hopefully write a book about it all.
Yeah, definitely.
Including yourself.
It's been one hell of a ride, and it's amazing to think that we have Premier League football at Dean Court these days instead of like you say, the old Division 3, 4 like it used to be. It's amazing how the club has moved on, and it's great to see, and long may it continue. But thank you, David, for agreeing to come on today. It's been wonderful to sit here and listen to everything that you've told us, and I'm sure our subscribers and our viewers are going to be very interested in watching this interview. So I thank you very much for your time, sir.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure, and having to shuffle through a few old programs and newspaper reports and bits and bobs has just given me a little trip on memory. Which normally I'm not that sort of an individual, but talking about other players and other situations is really quite nice for me, and not just about myself. And I appreciate your help in guiding me into some of these answers.
No, that's fine. It's been absolutely fantastic. And as soon as I read your book, I thought straight away we need to get you on and do this show, because I think it's been a fantastic career that you've had, and it's been really wonderful to learn more from you. So it's hopefully in a few weeks' time we'll arrange to meet again and go through your squads that you've put in the book. Your best played with and your best played against, which I'll send you an email about, and we'll arrange a time. And I think that'd be a great chat as well, because you've played against and played with some real great players that'd be amazing to learn more about. So I shall be in touch.
That side is quite an interesting one, because I feel very humble. I'm not a sort of person that goes around, shouting and all the rest of it. I'm quite a humble, I like to think I'm quite a humble, straightforward guy. Competitive, like to win, but very appreciative of other people. Yes. And I think moving from football, into the financial world, dealing with people again, was quite interesting. It set me up for later life. So thanks.
That has been great. Thank you, David. Well, thank you for joining us today and listening to David's story. It's been a fantastic interview. It's been one that's been really, really enjoyable to sit down with David and listen to his tales from his great book, which is here, David Stock's In the Shadows. I recommend it highly. It's a very, very good read. And like I say, we've learned some stories from the book today, but there are many more stories in there. So any Cherries fan, to be fair, any footballer from that era, or any football fan from that era, and even football fans of today, will find it extremely interesting and how it compares to modern day football. But thank you for joining me today. It's been a very enjoyable one. Thank you to David and his wife Deborah for arranging the time to join us. And we'll be back soon with David. We're going to discuss with David his best select 11 that he's played with and who he's played against, which looks set to be a very good show and full of memories. So join us then. But till the next time, up the Cherries.
The Talksport Fan Network.
The ultimate on-demand destination for the UK's best fan-led football podcasts.
Want authentic supporter insight on all things Bournemouth? Follow Up the Cherries in all departments on the Talksport Fan Network.
Club-dedicated content created by the fans, for the fans.
Search Talksport Fan Network.